What if the U.S. invaded Japan instead of dropping the atomic bomb? In the summer of 1945, the Pacific War was reaching its brutal climax. Germany had surrendered in May, and the United States, along with its allies, had turned its full attention toward Japan. The firebombing of Tokyo and other cities had already killed hundreds of thousands, yet Japan's military leaders showed little willingness to surrender. American planners faced a grim choice: either continue the air campaign and blockade that starved the country into submission, or launch a direct invasion of the Japanese homeland. Historically, President Harry Truman authorized the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, ending the war in a matter of days. But what if Truman had chosen differently? What if the United States had invaded Japan instead of dropping the atomic bomb? To understand the scale of this alternate scenario, we must begin with Operation Downfall, the actual invasion plan developed by American strategists. It was divided into two massive operations: Olympic, targeting the southern island of Kyushu, and Coronet, aimed at the Tokyo plain on Honshu. Operation Olympic was scheduled for November 1945, and Coronet for the spring of 1946. Together, they would have been the largest amphibious assaults in history, dwarfing even the Normandy landings. The U.S. military anticipated deploying millions of troops, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft, against a Japanese defense force determined to fight to the last man. American intelligence estimated that Japan had more than 2 million soldiers ready to defend the home islands, with millions more civilians mobilized into the so-called Volunteer Fighting Corps. These were men and women, even children, trained with bamboo spears, old rifles, and makeshift weapons. Japanese propaganda portrayed the coming battle as a sacred defense of the emperor and the nation's honor. For many, fighting to the death was seen as more honorable than surrender. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff knew that this invasion would not only be a military operation, but also a cultural collision with a population prepared for mass sacrifice. Casualty estimates varied widely, but the numbers were staggering. Some American planners feared that the invasion could result in up to 1 million U.S. casualties, with Japanese deaths many times higher. The fighting on Okinawa earlier that year had given a grim preview. Over 12,000 American dead, more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and tens of thousands of civilians lost in a single battle. Okinawa was only a small island. The home islands promised to be far worse. Hospitals were already preparing for unprecedented waves of wounded, stockpiling blood plasma and medical supplies in anticipation of a bloodbath. Yet Truman and his advisors were not only thinking about military losses, they were also weighing the political and strategic consequences. Prolonging the war through an invasion meant keeping millions of American servicemen under arms for at least another year, at enormous financial cost. The American public, though supportive of victory, was weary after years of total war. Families longed for their sons to return. A drawn-out invasion risked testing the patience of a nation that believed it had already given enough. On the Japanese side, the government was divided. Some officials sought peace through Soviet mediation, while others pushed for one last great battle to secure better terms. The military, especially the Army, had no intention of surrendering unconditionally. Their strategy was to inflict such horrific casualties on the invading Americans that Washington might negotiate a settlement preserving the Emperor and Japan's autonomy. This was the mindset that awaited U.S. soldiers if the atomic bombs had never been used. The first step of this alternate timeline begins in November 1945, when American forces prepare to storm Kyushu. Thousands of landing craft line the horizon, carrying divisions hardened by years of island-hopping campaigns. The skies are filled with aircraft, bombers softening beach defenses, fighters patrolling for kamikaze attacks. The seas churn with naval artillery, pounding Japanese fortifications day and night. For the U.S., this is the final push, the decisive strike to end a war that has consumed the world. For Japan, it is the last stand, a desperate gamble to defend sacred soil. the beaches of Kyushu become the stage where history takes a different turn. The invasion of Kyushu begins at dawn on November 1st, 1945. For weeks beforehand, American bombers have pounded coastal defenses, while the Navy has shelled ports and military installations across southern Japan. Yet when the landing craft lower their ramps and U.S. Marines and soldiers rush toward the beaches, they find that the Japanese defenders have prepared in ways far beyond what planners expected. Instead of shallow defenses easily broken by naval artillery, the Japanese have built layered fortifications deep into hillsides, camouflaged artillery, and vast networks of tunnels. Every landing zone becomes a killing ground. Kamikaze pilots, believed by some to have been nearly spent, re-emerge in terrifying numbers. Hundreds of planes, some outdated trainers, and civilian aircraft loaded with explosives hurl themselves against the invasion fleet. In the first week alone, dozens of American ships are sunk or crippled, with thousands of sailors lost at sea. Hospital ships overflow with casualties before the beachheads are even secured. The horror of Okinawa repeats itself on an even greater scale. On land, the fighting is slow and brutal. Every yard of ground costs American lives. Hills are stormed, captured, and then retaken by counterattacks launched at night. Civilians, heavily indoctrinated, were prepared to resist in any way possible, even with improvised means. Units trained in island warfare now face an entire society mobilized for total defense. Stories spread among U.S. troops of farmers ambushing patrols or children acting as spies. Soldiers begin to see every figure in the distance, not just as an innocent bystander, but as a potential threat. The casualty lists climb daily. Within 2 weeks, more than 50,000 Americans are killed or wounded, shocking commanders who had hoped that overwhelming firepower would bring quick results. Letters home paint a grim picture of beaches stained red and villages reduced to ash. The American public, reading newspaper reports, is torn between outrage and determination. Families fear for their loved ones, while newspapers demand victory at any cost. President Truman faces mounting pressure from both Congress and military leaders. Should the invasion continue despite the staggering losses, or should alternative methods, like intensified firebombing or even a demonstration of the atomic bomb, be reconsidered? In Japan, the defenders see the sacrifice as proof of their nation's resolve. Government propaganda celebrates each kamikaze attack as divine retribution, each soldier's death as honorable service to the emperor. Yet beneath the surface, food shortages and civilian suffering deepen. Cities already devastated by firebombing are now swamped with refugees from Kyushu. Hunger and disease spread rapidly, but rather than weakening the will to fight, in many cases it hardens it. Japanese military leaders believe that the heavier the casualties they inflict, the more likely the Americans will offer a negotiated peace. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union watches closely. Having declared war on Japan in August, Soviet troops sweep through Manchuria and advance toward Korea. Stalin's armies eye the possibility of sharing in the conquest of the Japanese homeland. In this alternate timeline, the longer the American invasion drags on, the greater the chance that Soviet forces attempt their own landing in Hokkaido. The fate of post-war Japan and the balance of power in Asia hangs in the balance. By December 1945, the battle for Kyushu has devolved into a grinding war of attrition. Entire towns are leveled, mountainsides collapse under relentless bombardment, and the beaches remain clogged with wreckage. American commanders realize that even if Kyushu is captured, the cost of advancing to Honshu, where the capital Tokyo awaits, may be too great to bear. Rumors spread of casualty estimates reaching 500,000 before the war is done. Soldiers whisper among themselves, was there another way to end the war? Was the invasion truly worth the blood price being paid on Japanese soil? By early 1946, the struggle for Kyushu has become one of the most brutal campaigns in modern warfare. Entire divisions are locked in combat that moves at a pace of only a few miles per month. The terrain, riddled with caves, bunkers, and forests, favors the defenders. American forces pour in reinforcements, but every gain comes at staggering cost. Bodies line the hillsides, and medics work around the clock to save the endless flow of wounded. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience is a nightmare. Men who fought through Normandy, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa confess that nothing compares to the ferocity of Kyushu. Units advance only to be encircled and cut down by fanatical resistance. Air supremacy and naval bombardment, so decisive on other islands, cannot completely break Japan's entrenched defenses. Villages become fortresses, civilians are used as human shields, and suicide attacks grow ever more desperate. The impact on American morale begins to show. Newspapers report casualty figures in the hundreds of thousands, sparking outrage in cities from New York to Chicago. Families who had celebrated victory in Europe now receive telegrams announcing the deaths of sons, brothers, and husbands. War bond drives and patriotic rallies continue, but under the surface, discontent rises. Some members of Congress openly question the invasion strategy, demanding that the government explore alternatives before more lives are wasted. President Truman faces one of the greatest dilemmas in U.S. history. Without the use of the atomic bomb, he relies on conventional means: firebombing campaigns, naval blockades, and relentless ground assaults. Yet the Japanese government remains defiant. The hope that capturing Kyushu would break morale has proven false. Instead, Tokyo declares the sacrifices of the defenders to be a glorious testament to the spirit of the nation. Leaflets dropped by American planes urging surrender are ignored or used as fuel in cooking fires. As winter deepens, the humanitarian crisis worsens. Millions of Japanese civilians face starvation as supply lines collapse. Transportation networks are shattered by bombing, leaving regions cut off from food and medicine. Diseases like typhus and dysentery spread through crowded shelters. In this alternate timeline, Japan's cities do not fall quickly to atomic fire, but instead waste away under siege, creating scenes of suffering unseen in the original history. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union capitalizes on the chaos. Having already occupied Manchuria and Korea, Stalin turns his eyes toward the northern Japanese islands. In January 1946, Soviet forces begin landing in Hokkaido, establishing a foothold that alarms Washington. For the first time, American commanders realize that the longer the war drags on, the greater the chance of Japan being divided between East and West, just as Germany had been. This possibility, once unthinkable, now threatens to reshape the entire balance of power in Asia. Within the Japanese High Command, divisions sharpen. Some generals argue for continuing the fight to the last breath, while others secretly reach out to neutral parties to explore peace terms. Yet the insistence on preserving the emperor and avoiding unconditional surrender remains a barrier. For Washington, anything less than total capitulation is politically unacceptable. The war grinds on, fueled by pride, ideology, and the unwillingness of either side to back down. By the time spring approaches, Kyushu is in ruins, with American forces barely controlling half the island. Estimates for the planned second invasion, Operation Coronet, targeting the Tokyo plain, are now catastrophic, with predictions of hundreds of thousands more Allied dead. The question grows louder with each passing week. How far is the United States willing to go to achieve victory without the atomic bomb? As the spring of 1946 unfolds, American military planners move forward with preparations for the second phase of the invasion, Operation Coronet. This assault, scheduled for March, would target the Kanto Plain, the heart of Japan and home to Tokyo, the Imperial Palace, and the country's remaining political leadership. Unlike the rugged mountains and narrow valleys of Kyushu, the plains of Honshu offer wide, open fields suitable for massed armies. Yet this advantage also makes them perfect killing grounds for Japanese defenders. Intelligence reports warn that Japan is concentrating its remaining divisions on Honshu. Estimates suggest over 1 million troops are being positioned to defend the approaches to Tokyo, supported by millions of civilian militia. Schools, temples, and factories are converted into strongpoints. Fields are seeded with mines, rivers prepared for flooding, and entire towns transformed into defensive fortresses. For Japanese leaders, Coronet is not just another battle. It is the ultimate stand for national survival. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff debate the risks with growing unease. Kyushu has already consumed far more lives than expected, and now casualty predictions for Honshu soar to levels unimaginable at the start of the war. Some forecasts suggest 500,000 American dead or wounded and millions of Japanese casualties. Generals whisper that the United States could exhaust its manpower before the war is finished. Even with overwhelming naval and air superiority, the question remains: can a democracy endure such losses in pursuit of unconditional surrender? President Truman, battered by criticism, faces the possibility of history judging him as the man who prolonged the war unnecessarily. The atomic bomb still exists as a potential option, but in this alternate timeline, its use has been delayed, debated, and doubted. Many advisors urge him to reconsider, arguing that continuing the invasion could not only devastate Japan, but also weaken America's global standing. Yet others insist that America must prove it can win with conventional force, lest future wars depend entirely on nuclear terror. Meanwhile, Emperor Hirohito struggles within his gilded cage. In the historical timeline, the shock of the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion pushed him to intervene, overriding the military to accept surrender. Here, without that decisive blow, his role becomes more complicated. Advisors debate whether he should address the nation to prevent further ruin, but hardline generals still control much of the government. They argue that the emperor's sacred authority should inspire one last massive battle, not compromise. Hirohito hesitates, unwilling to betray the warriors fighting in his name, even as the nation collapses around him. On the ground in Japan, the civilian population endures unimaginable suffering. Food shortages lead to malnutrition, while cities still recovering from firebombing struggle to house waves of refugees. Mothers barter family heirlooms for rice. Children scavenge in ruins for scraps. Air raid sirens still wail as American bombers crisscross the skies, dropping not just explosives but psychological leaflets, warning of an inevitable invasion. In the countryside, farmers fear both famine and the arrival of foreign troops. Internationally, the world watches anxiously. Britain and Australia, weary from years of war, begin pressuring Washington to seek alternatives to invasion. China, still embroiled in its own civil war, watches with cautious interest as the Japanese struggle on. And in Moscow, Stalin sees opportunity. Soviet troops dig in across Hokkaido, declaring their presence as a permanent occupation. Rumors spread of plans to carve Japan into zones of control, just as Germany and Berlin had been divided. This possibility alarms U.S. policymakers who fear not only the cost of invasion, but also the geopolitical consequences of delay. As March approaches, American soldiers stationed in the Philippines and Okinawa prepare for yet another massive operation. Veterans whisper that it will make Normandy look small by comparison. Some steel themselves with determination, others confess to fear. Letters home reveal the grim truth. Many do not expect to survive. Operation Coronet promises to be the climactic battle of the Second World War, one that could determine not just the fate of Japan, but the post-war order of the entire world. On March 1st, 1946, the largest amphibious assault in history begins. At dawn, the waters off the Kanto Plain churn with the arrival of thousands of landing craft, battleships, and carriers. Operation Coronet has commenced. For weeks, bombers have pounded rail lines, factories, and supply depots, but Japanese forces remain dug in, waiting for the inevitable clash. Entire families line the coasts, some to fight, others to pray, while the Japanese army prepares to resist with every weapon left at its disposal. The American landings are massive, involving more than 1 million troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Yet sheer numbers do not guarantee an easy victory. As soldiers storm ashore, they face an onslaught of artillery, machine gun fire, and suicide charges. Kamikaze pilots strike again, this time not only at ships but at supply depots hastily built on the beaches. Explosions ripple across the coastline, sending smoke plumes high into the sky. The casualty rate rivals, and then surpasses, the horror of Kyushu. Civilians add to the chaos. Women and children, indoctrinated by months of propaganda, join the defense with bamboo spears, Molotov cocktails, and improvised explosives. American soldiers, trained to distinguish combatants from civilians, now find themselves in situations where hesitation means death. The psychological toll is immense. Reports spread of units refusing to take prisoners, driven by exhaustion and fear. What was once envisioned as a military campaign becomes a nightmarish struggle against an entire nation mobilized for destruction. Despite this, the U.S. advance pushes inland, supported by overwhelming firepower. Villages are leveled, roads shattered, and farmland consumed in smoke. Tokyo itself braces for attack, its streets fortified with barricades, its subways turned into bunkers. For Japanese commanders, every mile gained by the Americans is a chance to inflict more losses, hoping that public opinion back in the United States will demand an end to the war before unconditional surrender is achieved. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union seizes the moment. Red Army divisions expand their occupation of Hokkaido and begin sending signals toward the Japanese Communist Party, encouraging them to prepare for a new political order once the war ends. Stalin's goal becomes clear: a divided Japan, split between East and West, mirroring the fate of Germany. Washington realizes with growing alarm that the longer coronet drags on, the greater the chance of losing not just lives, but control of Japan's post-war destiny. The Japanese leadership faces its own breaking point. Supplies dwindle, cities crumble, and the once mighty imperial army bleeds dry. Yet hardliners cling to the belief that a climactic battle might force a negotiated peace. Meetings in Tokyo are heated, with some officials secretly seeking a way to contact the Allies, while generals insist that surrender would dishonor the emperor and the nation. Hirohito, caught between pride and survival, remains silent, his decision postponed even as his people starve. By May 1946, the battle for Honshu becomes a grinding stalemate. American forces control parts of the Kanto Plain, but at staggering cost, hundreds of thousands dead or wounded. Japanese losses, both military and civilian, soar into the millions. Entire towns vanish beneath the weight of artillery barrages. The devastation resembles the aftermath of a natural disaster, only this disaster is man-made and relentless. Still, Tokyo refuses to yield. As the world watches, the war in Japan takes on a new dimension. No longer is it simply about defeating an enemy. It has become a test of endurance between two nations, unwilling to break. Yet behind the front lines, voices in Washington and Moscow begin to ask, is the future of Asia being decided not by victory alone, but by how much each side is willing to sacrifice to claim it? By the summer of 1946, Japan is a nation in ruins. Fields lie scorched, railways destroyed, and millions of civilians wander homeless through shattered cities. American bombers continue to darken the skies, while ground forces grind their way across Honshu in battles that consume thousands of lives each week. The invasion has already exceeded the bloodiest predictions, and still, Tokyo refuses to surrender. Within the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito faces the moment of decision. His advisors are divided. The army demands continued resistance, while a growing number of officials plead for intervention before Japan is reduced to ashes. For months, Hirohito has remained silent, but the devastation outside his palace walls has reached unimaginable levels. By June, famine grips the nation. Disease spreads unchecked. For the first time in Japanese history, the emperor contemplates speaking directly to his people, not to inspire them to fight, but to beg them to survive. On the front lines, American commanders are exhausted. The casualty toll has surpassed 750,000 killed and wounded, with more arriving daily. Soldiers write home describing a war that feels endless, a nightmare that consumes entire divisions. In Washington, newspapers openly question Truman's judgment. Some politicians demand that the atomic bomb, still unused in this timeline, be unleashed to end the war. Others argue that after so much blood has been shed, a negotiated peace may be the only realistic outcome. Truman's presidency hangs in the balance, caught between the promise of victory and the weight of human suffering. The Soviets seize their chance. By mid-1946, Stalin's forces control all of Hokkaido and begin supplying communist cells across Japan. Rumors swirl of a potential provisional government being organized under Soviet protection. Just as Germany was divided into East and West, Japan now faces the same prospect. American strategists realize too late that their sacrifice may have opened the door to a new geopolitical crisis: the partition of Japan and the spread of communism deeper into Asia. When Hirohito finally addresses the nation, it is a moment of stunned silence. Instead of declaring victory, he urges his people to lay down their arms. He speaks not of surrender as humiliation, but as preservation of the Japanese race. His intervention comes too late to prevent mass death, but it halts further destruction. The government accepts terms that allow the emperor to remain, but Japan itself lies broken, divided between American and Soviet occupation zones. The consequences of this alternate history ripple far beyond 1946. With Japan split into two rival states, Asia becomes the central battlefield of the Cold War even earlier than in our timeline. Korea, already divided, is joined by a fractured Japan, ensuring decades of tension. The U.S. pays a staggering price in lives and resources, leaving its people weary of foreign wars. The atomic bomb, never dropped, remains a weapon untested in combat, its shadow hanging over future conflicts. For Japan, the scars run even deeper. Instead of 2 destroyed cities, nearly every major urban center is reduced to rubble. Millions more perish from famine, disease, and violence. The country enters the post-war world not as a rebuilt democracy allied with the West, but as a divided nation, a pawn in the global struggle between Washington and Moscow. The miracle of Japan's economic rise never comes to pass. Instead, its people endure decades of occupation, suspicion, and division. In this alternate reality, the question lingers: was the invasion more humane than the atomic bomb? The numbers suggest otherwise. While the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed over 200,000 people, the invasion claims millions. The United States suffers catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union gains a foothold in Japan, and the Cold War begins with even deeper fault lines. History once again turns on a single decision: whether to drop the bomb or to step ashore on enemy soil. And in this scenario, the world pays a price far greater than the one written in our reality.